Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and I'd like to talk to you about color control, not just in the Sony Alpha cameras themselves, but also through the entire photographic workflow from capture through to output. We'll start with the camera, however, and we'll look at three controls that we can change, which are white balance, saturation, and color gamut. Now, these don't necessarily apply to the raw files, although they will modify the view inside of the EVF or Finder and also the monitor themselves. The white balance, however, will set a reference point for the raw file so that when you start editing, you'll start from that white balance setting. Changing the white balance setting inside of a raw editor will not negatively impact on the quality of that raw file. Now let's start looking at the white balance. Most photographers using the Sony Alpha cameras will be using auto white balance. What some of you may fail to notice, however, in the latest model cameras, we do have some control over how that auto white balance works. And this includes whether we set it to standard, ambience, or white. Now, if we set it to ambience, as we start recording and say warm tungsten lighting, we are going to retain some of that warm lighting effect. However, if we set it to white, we're going to basically neutralize the whites, so you won't have any presence of that warm ambient light. So it's already some choices. Now, if you do want to fine-tune the white balance yourself, the auto white balance, we can just scroll over to the right and then start moving that white balance. So if you think that the camera that you're using, for instance, records slightly cool, you could actually warm that up slightly and have that as your default auto white balance setting. Now, auto white balance is a variable and it will move, and for people who don't want the white balance to move for each and every shot that they're taking, we can set white balance presets. So you can set it off for daylight, shade, cloudy, and there you'll get consistency so long as the weather conditions basically stay the same. Now, this is quite important for movie shooters who don't want the white balance to change just because a woman in a yellow dress suddenly appeared front and center in the frame. Remember, the white balance is a little bit like exposure. It is going to try and average everything out. Now, most of the time it does work quite effectively, but it will make mistakes. So for those people who are super meticulous about their white balance, it is possible to make a custom white balance. Now, I have two movies on creating a custom white balance because the nature of creating a custom white balance has changed with the later model cameras. Basically, it involves pointing the camera at something that you know to be absolutely neutral. Now, by far and away, the best thing to point the camera at is a white balance reference card, something that is guaranteed to be grey with no colour at all. Now, these surfaces tend to be non-reflective because if something very colourful is nearby, it will reflect that colour. So you're basically looking for a white balance reference with a matte surface. Now, another way we can control color in the camera, and it will these changes will appear in the Finder and on the monitor, but won't affect the raw file, as I've said previously. We can control saturation, the richness or vibrance of those colors, by going to the creative style. Now, you'll find that in the same menu tab as the auto white balance settings, so you should be able to find that quite easily. Now, as well as changing the saturation, we can go up or down. We'll also have some presets, some creative styles. Now, as a raw shooter, I don't tend to use these, but I would like to point out that there is one instance where some photographers might like to use one of those creative styles. For instance, if you know a series of images is going to be black and white, it would help you to pre-visualize what it is you're capturing because the color will be a distraction while you're photographing. So you could set the black and white creative style, so that as you're viewing your scene, your landscape perhaps, you're going to be seeing that in black and white, so that color will no longer be a distraction to you. Now, if you ever did change your mind with a raw file, you could just remove that black and white. Obviously, that again, that black and white creative style is not going to get embedded in the raw file itself. Now, finally, number 3 is the color gamut. This is where we pick it up through the color space. Now you probably noticed that I'm spelling color slightly differently to what you may be doing. It is one of those differences between American English and English English. So one of the things that you've only got two choices here, sRGB and Adobe RGB. Some of you may be thinking, why have I got the word Adobe on my non-Adobe camera? And the simple reason for that is Adobe introduced color management and this larger color space back in 1998, and this has been an industry standard ever since. Now, the reason Adobe wanted to create this new working space was that they felt sRGB, which was a standard, was a little bit small. It was especially too small for if you intended to create images for print. Now, sRGB is sometimes referred to as safe RGB. It's the lowest common denominator. Downside of it being safe is it is quite a small space, so some of the colors you're not going to fit into that space. Some people unflatteringly call sRGB something else because they're not really impressed with the size of that color gamut. Just to show you in a 3D model of these two gamuts, the sRGB is sitting inside that white frame, which is the Adobe RGB color space, and that has 40% more volume of colors, and we're talking about the rich colors it can encompass. Now, is that a big thing for photographers? Well, if you are printing, yes, it is a big thing. What I'm showing you here is that colored shape here is the gamut or three-dimensional model of the sort of colors that my printing profile can achieve. Now, a lot of those colors are out of gamut of the sRGB. The sRGB gamut is too small for some of the colors that my printer is capable of reproducing. So if I just move out to the Adobe RGB space, it can fit pretty much most of those colors that my printer can achieve. And we'll come back to this subject a little bit later. But first of all, I just want to point out that some of you may be asking, well, what happens to those colors that are outside of that small sRGB color gamut? And what happens is when a color reaches maximum saturation in a small gamut, it starts to lose detail. And I've got an example here of this very colorful red parrot, and I've pushed some of the colors of that red so they're out of gamut. They can't be contained with that color space anymore, and you can see the erosion of detail. We're not seeing that fine detail anymore. Now, if you are going to use an Adobe RGB color gamut, it would make sense to use a monitor that can also display Adobe RGB color gamut. Now, the vast majority of monitors are more closely aligned to the sRGB. So if you are a photographer who likes working with very rich colors, you might want to consider getting one of the color accurate monitors. Now, there's a variety of companies that make this. The one that I'm currently using is a BenQ SW271, and that pretty much nails the Adobe color gamut. It's got some other benefits as well. And if you are putting your monitor, say, in a working space, most monitors have quite shiny glass on the front of the monitor, which is not a great thing, to be honest. And you can pick up surface reflections, not only from nearby windows, but also what you're wearing. So you would tend to have to avoid wearing brightly colored clothes when editing, because those colors are going to be reflected in your monitor. So the actual positioning of your monitor in your studios or office space is actually quite important. The color accurate monitors you can buy come with these hoods that actually shield them from stray bright lights that might be in your working space. It's a bit like having a lens hood for your monitor, and there's not many landscape photographers who would start shooting and leave their lens hood at home. It is an important part of the kit if you're being a little bit meticulous there. If you don't have one of these color accurate monitors, then I would recommend that you both calibrate and profile your monitor. Now, a color accurate monitor such as my BenQ, it'll come pretty much out of the box, pretty much bang on, and be very color accurate. But most monitors are not. Most monitors are actually a long way off from being accurate. So you need a device to measure how inaccurate it is and describe the characteristics of that monitor. And the one way to do that is to invest in a monitor profiling device, often referred to as calibrators. But the most important aspect of what they do, in my opinion, is to profile the colors, map out the relationship of the colors themselves. So you're not seeing maybe blues that are a little bit cyan on your monitor. Once you've created a profile for your monitor, your Adobe software will take over and put the colors exactly where they should be. They'll basically be adjusted on the fly so they're displayed accurately. Now, if you're going to go to that much trouble, I would also recommend that you profile your camera as well. The cameras do have what's called canned profiles, which the software manufacturers use. It's a one-size-fits-all type of approach, and there is some room for error here. So there are calibration devices or profiling devices you can actually purchase, and the one that I'm currently using is a color checker passport. Basically, this is a piece of hardware with known colors that are known of known value, which then can be measured when photographed, and the calibration device can measure how accurate those colors actually are. And this will create a unique profile for your camera. If you're going to go that far, you might as well complete the picture here. So we're getting very faithful colors from the camera. They're being shown very faithfully on our monitor, on our profiled monitor, and then we pass those files over to a printer. Again, they're going to be very faithfully reproduced by the printer because we've also profiled that printer. And this is the nature of color management. Some of the manufacturers, I think it was Canon who termed the phrase color science. There isn't actually any color science in that term. The true term is called color management, and it's been around in photography since that 1998. Now, it is possible to get the colors coming out of a Canon camera pretty much similar to the ones coming out of a Nikon or a Sony camera. So some people who buy cameras on the fact that the skin tones are better on this make of camera are actually missed the point of color management. If you want to get into that in a little bit more detail, just head over to my website, markgaylor.com. There is a free to download color management PDF there that will go into this in a lot more detail. I want to now complete the picture here and go take those files that we've captured on my profiled camera and start editing them inside of Lightroom. Now, you may have heard me say that Lightroom is a linear or a non-linear program. It doesn't really matter what you adjust first. You can start with what offends you the most about the file and then finish up with what offends you the least. Now, there is a small exception to that. The starting point that the software manufacturers choose basically pre-cooks the raw file. So you're presented the file not in a completely raw state, but in a slightly modified state. And we do have the ability to change that default in Lightroom. So if you're not entirely happy with the starting point, you can modify that. Some people will say they prefer the look of their raw files in a program such as Capture One, but the only reason that the files look slightly different in Capture One, it's a different software manufacturer, so they've chosen a different starting point for you to start editing that file. It doesn't necessarily mean the program's any better, it's just different. Now, we can go into Lightroom and change the default. Now, at the very top of that basic panel, you'll see that the profile being used on the current versions of Lightroom is something called Adobe Color. If you're using an older version of the software, you'll see it as Adobe Standard, and the colors won't look so vibrant with those versions of the software. But you can change that. If you prefer more vibrant colors, this is where you can go in and modify that. So on the latest versions of Lightroom, you can just click on those four little squares to the right of the profile, and this is the profile browser, and you can now go in and look at dozens of profiles to offer you an alternative starting point before you even start moving any of the sliders in that basic panel. Now, Adobe will give you half a dozen or more of their own profiles, but also there's camera matching profiles. This is where you're trying to pick up different Sony flavors of how to start the file. For instance, if you find that the shadows are always looking a little bit dark in your files when you start, you could maybe move over to that light profile, which will lighten the shadows quite significantly. Now, because I've actually created a custom profile for my camera, the software that created that profile has added that to the list of profiles that are now available for Lightroom to use. You would have to restart Lightroom for that profile to become visible, but you can see I've created one profile for this camera using that X-Rite Color Passport. So this is where I would choose my custom profile that's absolutely faithful to the colors that I've been capturing. Now, all I need to do if I want to use that profile regularly is add it to my favorites. What I can do now is I can access that profile not by going into the profile browser anymore, but just from the drop down menu. Now, if the thought of having to change the profile at the start of editing every single image is a little bit unlikely, you can actually create a new default so that all of your images that you're importing now will have that new profile and will no longer be using Adobe Color. So the way we would do that, and I'll just add one more piece of information that does relate to color. Now, it is possible to do some lens corrections inside of the Sony Alpha cameras. One of these lens corrections is embedded into that raw file. It's the chromatic aberration. Now, if Lightroom picks up that this lens correction has already been applied, you'll see there's a notification, a little information icon, and if you were to click on that, it would say this has already been applied. If, however, you've had that switched off in the camera, it is possible to apply that now and add that to your new develop default that we're about to create. Again, if you're using some older Lightroom software, all you'd need to do now is press down the Alt key on a PC, Option key on a Mac, and look for that new or set default button in the bottom right hand corner of the develop window, and then you'd just click Update to Current Settings. Now, it is important that when you do click this button, anything else that you've applied to that raw file will now be incorporated into the new default. So if you've been messing around with curves or highlights or shadows, that will become part of the default as well. So just tread a bit carefully here. Start with an unedited file and only add those things that you now want to change and add to every single file. Now, what you'll do on the latest versions of Lightroom is it's a little bit more involved. You first have to create a preset with some of those things you've been changing, such as your treatment and profile. Treatment means color or black and white. The profile is the interesting thing there, and also any lens corrections. You could also add other things that if you're always adding 20% vibrance, you could actually just incorporate that now into your new default so that you don't have to do that with each and every image that you edit from now on. You will then go into Lightroom's preferences. And now there's a 4-step process here. First, you'll click on the Use Defaults Specific to Camera Model. Then you'll choose your camera model. In this case, it's my Alpha 9 camera. Then you'll choose the preset that you just created. Okay, and then you'll click on the Create Default for that camera. And now, whenever you import images or restart the editing of an image that you've already been editing, it will revert to the new default, not Adobe's default. It's worth trying that out. If you've just created a new default for yourself, go to any image that you've edited, hit the reset button, and just see whether that your new profile and any other modifications you've been making now are the new defaults. Okay, so let's start doing a little bit of creative editing with color inside of Lightroom, and we'll start again with white balance. Now, as I did say, that the white balance chosen by auto white balance in the camera is used as a reference point. Now, this image was actually captured in the blue hour, as the sun has already set, so we're just getting a little bit of glow, and we're getting that cool dark blue in the background there. Now the camera has looked at the amount of blue and going, oh, this looks too blue, I'll throw in some more warm colors to try and neutralize that, and it's made an error, because what I would like to do is not choose what the camera sets as the white balance. I want to move that temperature slider cooler, so I invoke the feelings, the ambience of that blue hour. And as you can see, I get some very nice complementary colors by doing that. We get the warm colors of the skin and the cool blue tones of the background. So that was definitely worth playing with white balance in this instance. Same again, we've gone into blue hour again, and the cameras will always throw lots of orange at this situation and always spectacularly get blue hour incorrect. So again, we just have to grab that temperature slider, move it to the left, and again we'll find that we now invoke those complementary colors. The oranges in this image are going to be fairly much immune from us feeding in more cool tones, so we are going to protect some of those warm, very orange tones, but we are going to force those complementary colors once again. Now this was taken on a rainy day, on Anzac Day in Melbourne, and I'm not getting a real cool, cold feel of the wet streets behind this this military person here. And so again, just moving that color temperature slider down, we do get the cool, damp blue feel. Now I actually could just go and now target those warm tones and make those a little bit more saturated, because we do have the ability to target individual colors, which we'll deal with in shortly. But you can see again that I've also forced the complementary colors, which I do like doing when editing inside of Lightroom. To show you that it's not always using the temperature slider, this is the as shot. This is how the camera saw the white balance, and again it's not really hitting the mark. By this time moving the tint slider, I can force those complementary colors. Now admittedly the blues in here are leaning towards purple, perhaps a little bit too much magenta inside of these, but actually I like the feeling of this grading. Sometimes I don't always go for accuracy, I go for emotion, and I'm getting that emotion by using and forcing those complementary colors in this particular edit. Another photographer might choose more accurate rendition of those colors. And to show you something more forcibly moved, so in no way trying to be accurate at all, but just using color as an emotive tool when editing, here we've got some sand dunes which we've almost created the look that they're ocean waves, and so I've called this one Sea of Tranquility. We've actually forced the white balance to create colors which are wholly inaccurate but do have that cool, cold, emotive response that a lot of viewers will now get from this particular image. Now let's look at HSL, hue, saturation and luminance. Now a lot of photojournalists don't have the luxury of what I'm about to do, because the photograph is a record of something that actually happened. But if you're in more of an advertising, editorial or arts type approach, then you might find that as a color is not actually working inside of the composition. Imagine the Hollywood wardrobe department deciding that that green dress is not good look, so we just change the garments. I don't have the ability to change the garment of Gilbert Namala who's posing for me here, except in post-production I could grab those blue and purples and either move the color or desaturate those colors so they're not a distraction to the color palette of this particular image. To give you another example, I was photographing a meerkat in Melbourne Zoo. Now I'm thinking meerkats, Africa, perhaps the grass isn't so green. It certainly hasn't been in the wildlife documentaries I've seen about this particular animal. So I've grabbed those greens and moved the hue towards the yellows, and then I've also desaturated those yellows. So that green background is no longer a distracting element when the viewer is looking at my portrait of this meerkat. So you can see now how we're targeting individual colors. And when we're looking at that Anzac Day portrait where I'm trying to make the streets cooler, this is where I could target maybe the skin tones and make those warmer without losing those blue saturated colors. Now we can actually move and target colors and change their luminance value even when we're working in black and white. So we could grab the blues inside of this image and lower the luminance values to create this almost pitch black sky. So you can see how powerful these tools are, not only in color but also in black and white. Now what I've been showing now is global color edits through the white balance, targeted color adjustments through the HSL. Now we've got localized color adjustments using the graduated filters and the adjustment brush. Here I'm describing this process using a graduated filter. This again, the sun has set, so we're heading into blue hour again. But because I'm using a telephoto lens, you're missing out on the blue that I'm experiencing here. So what I'm going to do now is push that blue to the top of the image using a graduated filter, not just for exposure but also for color adjustment. And so now I'm getting that spread from the orange tones of the sun setting through to the blue hour tones of the sky above. And to show you that I can do that in a variety of images. Now don't look at the numbers when you're doing this, just pull the slider looking at the image itself, because sometimes you only need to pull that slider a very small amount, and sometimes you need to be quite aggressive to pull some blue into those orange tones. Let's look at the subject of toning now, sometimes referred to as color grading by people who edit movies. Now this is a full color image. I haven't edited the color in this particular image yet. We have two sliders in the basic panel that look at color adjustments. They're vibrance and saturation. Vibrance has a unique algorithm. It doesn't treat all colors equally. It tends to push colors that are already saturated slower than colors of lower saturation. So if I move the vibrance slider down, it will almost completely desaturate colors with only a little bit of color and leave the colors that are a little bit more vibrant alone. I can then move I'll just go back, I can then move the saturation slider to the right to restore the full saturation of those key colors. So it's a way of limiting the color palette very quickly without going into HSL. Now this again is a full color image, and I'm deciding that there's a few too many colors inside of this image, so I'm wanting to move more towards a monochromatic color palette. And in this instance I've decided to lower the vibrance and then increase the color temperature and move that color temperature slider to the right to create this semi-sepia look. Now it's not fully sepia because that would intimate that we're actually started with a black and white image and we're actually starting with a color, and some of those subtle differences in colors are still present in this image. They're just not as big because we've lowered that vibrant slider. And then I'm just changing the warmth of the image using the temperature slider. Now I've gone in and targeted some colors because we're not working with a black and white. I could target the pupils of those eyes or the iris of those eyes, and then come in and put in nice cold color to complement those warm sepia tones there. And we've got a little bit of a hue difference in the lips as well. So you can see that this is also a powerful tool, so we don't have to go full sepia. We can sit in a land somewhere between color and toned black and white. Here's another example, full color, and again using a feature called split toning. This is very popular in Hollywood movies, and that is to take the highlight color and feed in a hue, particularly warm hues typically go into the highlights, and then choose a complementary color for the shadows. And we see what's happening in here. The skin tones are preserved warm, but the shadow tones go a little bit cool. This is often referred to as orange and teal color grading when Hollywood resorts to using this particular technique, and we can use it very effectively when working on stills images inside of Lightroom. To show you this rolling out over a black and white image, we first select a color and a saturation value for the highlights, and then we typically choose a complementary color for the shadows. We can also then move the balance slider just above this tool here, so we can decide exactly what constitutes shadows and what are highlights. So we got a little bit more control than just choosing the two colors. Now here we can see a split toned image. Now I do offer presets that you can download for Lightroom from my website. Free to download, pay what you think they're worth. So just give them a try if you don't want to create some of your own presets. Presets are just a one-click edit of editing images inside of Lightroom. Let's move our attention now to output, because we've captured our images, we've graded our images. Now we're going to share our images either through screen or print. I just wanted to use this slide to show you the numbers are the color coordinates. These are what sort of put the colors on a map. But these numbers, the red, green and blue numbers, they're meaningless without a color space. Now when we leave Lightroom, we are going to have to assign a color space to the file. Now I'm just showing you the numbers here are different depending on whether we're in Adobe RGB or sRGB, but the images look identical, so the numbers can be different but the images can be identical. So what happens is, if the program looking at the file doesn't know what the color space is, it can reproduce those colors incorrectly. Okay, so let's take a look at how this might occur. Lightroom will tend to look after you. When you export images from Lightroom, the color space is embedded, and so if you upload to the internet, typically you're going to be safe, your colors will appear correctly. But if you take your image out to a program such as Photoshop, there are opportunities to damage and lose that color control. Now the defaults when leaving into a program like Photoshop from Lightroom is a color space called Pro Photo, which is a massive color space. It's much bigger than Adobe RGB, which sounds like a good thing, but it can catch you out, especially if you're not working in the 16 bits per channel. The problem with 16 bits per channel is JPEGs don't support 16 bits, so there's opportunities to damage the file because we drop the bit depth at an appropriate time. There are also opportunities to lose that color space inside of a program like Photoshop and then have a web browser such as Chrome or Safari to display those images incorrectly. So believe it or not, there are some default export workflows inside of Photoshop where embed color profile is unchecked by default, and also convert to sRGB is also unchecked, which is the safe RGB, remember, for internet land. Now most modern web browsers do actually recognize the Adobe RGB color space, so you can sort of upload images to the internet using Adobe RGB, but there is an element of risk there if those files get shared and then viewed and the color space is lost. let's take a look at how we can prepare images for print. Now, when we go into the Develop module, in the Tools bar there is an option which we can check called Soft Proofing. Now, instead of your highlights and shadow clipping warning, this is where we crush the blacks and we have no detail left in the blacks, or we blow out the highlights so there's no detail left in the highlights. These warnings now disappear and become monitor warnings and destination warnings. So they're not necessarily associated to luminance clipping anymore. They're much more to do with the Gamut clipping. So let's take a look at how we can use these tools to help protect our saturated colors. Now, this is where I've clicked on the monitor warning using not my BenQ color accurate monitor with the big Adobe RGB color space, but an Apple monitor which has a color space much closer to sRGB. And this blue color overlaid over that yellow is saying you can't accurately see the saturated color because I am incapable of displaying it. It's too saturated for my color gamut. So there may be more detail in that color, but I'm not going to show you because I can't. So there is a first warning. So now I've clicked off that monitor warning and clicked on the destination gamut warning, and interestingly the destination warning is having less of a problem with that yellow, primarily because one of the inks in CMYK is yellow. Unlike RGB, red, green, blue, we actually have a yellow dedicated ink, and so it's going to be more it's most likely that this yellow is going to be less out of gamut for a printer. So that's useful to know. But I have to say, with this particular paper surface I've chosen, a profile is to do with a printer, an ink set and a paper, then we can maybe choose a slightly different paper and see whether we can achieve full saturation and full detail, and that is possible. I've just selected a different profile linked to a different paper surface, and I realize now if I print out using this paper surface, that yellow is going to be in gamut for that printer, and that's very reassuring when you're preparing images for print. Now, if you're wanting a lot more information about this, it's worth having or building a relationship with a print service provider who you are going to work with to help you build your skills in this area. So you might be printing with the print service provider, or you might be just buying the tools like the profiles or your monitor or your calibration devices, and work with that company so that you absolutely can master and nail this quite challenging subject called color management. The good thing about color management is once you've got everything in place, it's going to stay in place, and you're not going to have to think about it every time you edit an image. You put in a little bit of legwork and you will be rewarded. Okay. We're coming to the end of the presentation now. If you haven't heard me present before, I'm Mark Gaylor. I have a website. All of my learning resources on this website are free to download, and then you're just invited to donate what you think they're worth. Now, I have lots of dedicated ebooks and also post-production ebooks, and I've also mentioned the color management ebook that you can download from my website. I've also got lots of other movies on the Alpha Creative Skills YouTube channel to help you master the camera so you can maximize your creativity when you're out in the field creating photographic images. If you're looking to acquire a mentor over an extended period of time to work through so you can build your craft skills, then head over to Patreon and just consider joining a monthly subscription fee. Some people might think $5 a month is a lot of money, but my students when I was working at the university were paying more than $500 a month for the privilege of getting this knowledge base and mastering their craft. Okay, so that completes the presentation, and I'll catch you online next time. Just remember to subscribe so you don't miss the future video tutorials that I'll be releasing on a regular basis. Okay, cheers.